Hi, welcome. I'm James Powell, Chief Technology Officer for Thomson Reuters. Welcome to TechVision. It's a speaker series bringing in external thought leaders who are going to talk about important technologies that have implications for our business and for our customers. So today we're very lucky to have Nigel who is a very eminent professor and also a founder of the Open Data Institute. You're the chairman and co-founder of the Open Data Institute. The Open Data Institute, I think, is really interesting because it's focused on unlocking data in a way where it can be used more broadly. And I think it has broad implications for us about how we think about providing our data and also how we can join with those kind of data initiatives. Nigel's going to give us a talk about open data, and then we're going to have a chance to do Q&A, which I think is probably the most interesting part of these conversations. So we'll get to that. But first of all, I'm looking forward to hearing from Nigel. Nigel's currently the Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Southampton, and as a director of the university's Web Science Institute, all going back to the original days of the web and then the semantic web with your colleague Tim Berners-Lee. He's published over 400 publications, including a book about privacy, which I think was quite prescient at the time. Everybody's talking about it now, but the book, The Spy and the Coffee Machine, I think has been very well received, and I certainly found it interesting. In 2013, he became a knight, and we were just talking about the tremendous impact that's had on his life, and listed as one of the 50 most influential people in UK IT. So very impressive. Please join me in welcoming Sir Nigel Shadbolt.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you for being here. They often say that a professor is somebody who speaks in their students' sleep. But all I will say is I'm just off a flight from the US, so I hope I don't end up speaking in my own sleep. So just bear with me as I gather my thoughts. This is a really interesting and opportune moment to be addressing you because actually a piece of work that we're doing jointly between the Open Data Institute and Thomson Reuters around some important aspects of how we can unlock the value of open data. The two institutions there, the University of Southampton, well, that's a university. It's got a strong tradition of doing work in computer science and over the years, the semantic web. The Open Data Institute was established a couple of years ago and Tim Berners-Lee and myself convinced the government to set aside some money to set up this independent institute. This is not run by or governed by anybody from government, but it's all about trying to unlock the value, find the value, the various types of value, indeed, in open data. So let me just start with the usual. The interesting thing about these kinds of slides, which show you either Moore's law or some other log-log relationship, an exponential relationship in a technology area, one thing is that if you want to get ahead in technology, try and find something that has that shape and get it named after yourself. Okay, so whatever it is, try and find it, whether it's storage capacity or wireless comms capacity or internet connection speeds. What that means, of course, is that the ability to solve problems in particular ways really can be disruptive and transformational in a way that even the experts kind of know but don't fully appreciate. So when I began to research artificial intelligence, well, more years than I care to remember, but my PhD, starting that in the late 70s, until now, there has been a 1 million-fold increase, 10 to the 6 increase, in the processing speed and power of the computers at our disposal. And that means almost everything my professors told me about what you couldn't solve using brute force, you now can, with a little insight. So the whole issue is how you bring insight and intelligence to bear on previously very, very hard problems. Fascinating area. And I think that, again, in the era of big data, these huge amounts and collections of data, we see that approaches that would have not been conceivable at all start to become practical. But what I'll argue today is that despite all this power, we still need structure and insight to make sense of all of this information. So, now do I have to point this in a particular way? There we are. So here's the other thing that's happening, and people talk about this as the Internet of Things. Sensors, the ubiquitous deployment of sensors is really exploding right now. And whether it'll be the next smartphones or the health apps you wear around your wrist or the various kinds of instrumentation in our homes and automobiles, this generation of data is going to provide huge new opportunities in business areas, services, and the rest of it. And of course, the interesting thing is that we all become sensors with these sensors, both with an S and a C, actually, if you think about it. It's quite an interesting idea of how the population at scale will be able to capture information in quite novel ways. That kind of outline on the right there, if you squint your eyes a bit, you might be able to make out a vague shape. That actually is, you can see the outline of London, the River Thames and the bridges across it, the main thoroughfares. That's generated, actually, each of those dark pixels that form that overview is a geocode of a Flickr photograph, okay? So that is a result of hundreds of thousands of people uploading their tagged photos, and those geocodes lay out a map, okay? The data at scale reveals patterns, and of course one of the really intriguing things about all of this is what you can discern in those patterns. With Flickr photos, you get rather more than just a geocode. Of course, people tag it, so with no processing at all, you can work out the top 20 tourist sites in London, what they're called, where they are, you know. And the fact that the incidental gathering of this information at scale will really be a remarkably disruptive feature of the next 10 years or so. And to expand the point, this inclusivity of the web, everybody's a censor, anyone can be an author. If you look at the encyclopedia that has been constructed through the collective efforts of people, Wikipedia in its various language versions, absolutely extraordinary how very high quality curated content at the core of Wikipedia has become a resource that is top 5, top 6 search terms on the planet in terms of the sites coming up. But everyone can now be a scientist, and this is a kind of another feature of the ubiquity of information and data and people combined together. This is Hanny Vorwerp on the left there. She got involved in a well-known citizen science program called Galaxy Zoo. This is where astronomers had way more data than they could ever analyze, and so a group of people in Oxford had the bright idea of putting people to work to crowdsource the solution. Evolution has gifted us a brilliant visual system evolved over millions of years, and we can be trained very quickly to tell one smudgy shape from another and describe it. And so by recruiting people into this and showing them and training them up pictures of deep sky objects, in this case galaxies, they processed in months what professional astronomers would have taken years and years to do. Okay. This is an interesting example where they might have been able to write really clever visual recognition software, but they didn't have the resources or the money to do it. People can do it. This hybridization of human computing with machine analytics, very interesting development we're seeing. And actually, in Hanny's example, a school teacher from Holland, she discovered a whole new unanticipated class of galaxy object, okay, the green peas as they're called, and is an author on the paper in the astronomy journals bearing her name. And anyone can be an innovator. This is Jack Andrika, a US student from Maryland who actually using a whole range of open source material. He did have to pay subscriptions for some of the medical literature, which really ticked him off a bit, came up with a highly innovative paper-based sensor for early diagnosis of cancers, where the previous technology required tests costing many hundreds of dollars. These paper-based sensors are 15 cents a shot. Okay. This is very disruptive. I mean, the thing that illustrates, of course, as Bill Joy famously said, not all the smart people work for you. So if you can actually imagine a world in which the innovation is more evenly accessible and distributed, what kind of world is that? And this is all, of course, because of the web that Tim has kind of bequested. You know, a world and an infrastructure which is open, based on universal standards, principles like net neutrality, open standards, an open platform, and actually open data. Now, I want to make just a point here that people have been making huge businesses out of open data for a long time. This is not a new concept. Open data, what is that? This is information available for anyone to use for any purpose at no cost. And to count as that, you usually have to have a license that says this is the case because of all sorts of legal restrictions otherwise, or worries around litigation such like, or warrants. Licenses help. But actually, here's an interesting example. Historically, this is not a new idea. My favorite example is actually both English, both from the 19th century. The first is Florence Nightingale, who used mortality data from the Crimean War and produced these wonderful infograms, these so-called coxcomb diagrams, which showed that most of the people dying in the British Army in the Crimea were dying in hospital-acquired infections and of disease, and they were not dying, essentially, on the battlefield in anything like the numbers they were elsewhere. Or John Snow's work in the cholera epidemic in London, where for the first time demonstrated that cholera was a waterborne disease. They didn't know that at the time. He did this by taking basic map data and looking at where the mortality was, who was dying where. And those black blocks you can see on the diagram there in the Soho area on Broad Street are individual deaths in a household. You quite clearly see it's located around a pump where people were drawing their water. Okay? So the correlation of data sets has a long tradition, and the power of those examples are that they should be openly available and scrutable. Okay, that was a key feature of that. And it's not stopped. You know, we're aware that genomics, proteomics couldn't be anywhere near where it currently is without an openly sequenced human genome. And in fact, a more interesting example, perhaps the GPS signal, if you think about that, and originally a military-grade invested technology, highly secret, highly classified, and then highly restricted to who could use it, was ultimately opened up to commercial reuse because the recognition was that openly available location data was of huge economic and social value. And here's another one. People don't think of this, but how did Page and Brin make their money? Well, they had some great mathematical ideas, did some very interesting engineering to scale up. But the resource they were using, there were all of those links that we as humans put into the web pages on the planet, openly available for them to harvest and apply the PageRank algorithm. So data as an open resource has a long tradition, and you don't have to look very far to understand how it can and might be monetized. But we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So in the UK, we've been engaged since about 2009. Tim and I began the work under the last government to open up public sector data. There'd been a tradition of people starting to argue that there was huge informational power in data that the government collected, but there was a general problem in making it easily available. And so we began work to try and systematically provide a way to publish this data out, to turn it into basic public policy. We were following on the heels of, in fact, the Obama administration. One of his early executive orders was to set up data.gov in the US, which was a similar effort to release federal data to be more available and widely used. And since 2009, we've had pretty impressive results in the UK. And by a lot of accounts, we come out at the top or near to the very top of a number of league tables on the kind and range and nature of the data we're publishing. To give you an idea of what that is, some of the early data that was released was around spending. And you might imagine that is that's an interest. So here's the idea is that you as the taxpayer have paid for this data. It's been collected usually for other purposes by government, national and local. If there's not a security or an issue around personal identity associated with that data, why isn't it just routinely published out? And if it is available, people might find more innovative things to do with it than you, the original data gatherer, had ever thought. Okay. So the example on the right is local government data. We moved to a position a number of years ago where every local authority was required, and there are 360 odd of them, were required to publish every month everything they spent above £500. That's an extraordinary data set. And of course, you know, it wasn't an impossible burden because they're all running ledger systems, they're all running financial management, but they had never made the data available in anything like an open or consistent way. So this was the requirement. Again, there is certain information that's redacted to do with payments to vulnerable children. You can imagine kind of types which aren't going to be published out, but a huge majority of it is. Okay. And what that led to very early on was a number of companies taking that data and running business intelligence over it. Procurement analysis, for example. The situation now exists where local authorities buy back insights from the data that they publish to understand their spending patterns in a way that they never understood before. Okay. To understand that they're buying certain services at a premium compared to other authorities. Why is that? I mean, it's had a very interesting effect. And of course, it's not the only reason you publish spending data. One of the ideas was to enhance accountability and transparency. We can come on to those other benefits shortly. Another area that has been contested, and now we're seeing progress on, is publishing the contracts that government let. You know, if these are contracts which are acquiring services and they're paid for in the public purse, why aren't they matters of public record? Now, that's been a very interesting exercise, not least because most of those contracts are not structured data. In fact, they're anything far from it. But even at the level of publishing the PDF, the actual digital version of the document at that level can still be hugely valuable. So governance and open data, spending and open data. Another area where there's been a lot of progress has been in the health sector. And this is an example of data from an organization, Public Health England. This is data from the NHS in England on, well, it's quite salutary. This is death rates. Okay, this is the 4 most likely ways of dying in England and variations between different local authorities. There are, in fact, in this case, there are 150 pertinent ones. And if you're in Manchester, you're going to, on average, die of one of those causes 2.5 years earlier than, on average, 2.5 years earlier than you would if you're living in leafy Richmond on Thames, okay? Now, this might not reveal much to people. You might say, well, we all know about postcode demographic changes, more deprived, richer areas. But even when you normalize for that, and there's some interesting examples where, for example, cities that are roughly balanced in terms of population and income types, you get clear league tables. The fact of publishing this data is that it allows a conversation to happen, to people to ask, why are these variances? Are there anything we can learn, any differences we can understand? And it isn't just in generic areas like that. Rather more specifically, we've got an example here of on the left-hand side, there, you've got a borough of London, and you're looking at obesity rates in children. Okay. It's really quite a dramatically paralyzing set of data when you see incipient diabetes and obesity problems in 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. On the right, we've got mortality measures in our hospitals, how likely you are to die in hospital X, Y, and Z for all of the English NHS hospitals. This is important data. This, for example, was data that allowed people to see that you were rather more likely to die if you were admitted into hospital at a weekend than not, and we might go, are we surprised, horrified? Well, it's changed the way that shift patterns are now managed in those hospitals. The publication of hospital infection rates, MRSA, C. difficile, things that you acquire in hospital, you can't prove cause and effect, but it's an interesting fact to reflect on that since those league tables were published, there's been an 85% decrease in hospital-acquired infections. And why? Well, one reason is because those at the bottom talk to those at the top, or the best performing inform those who are not performing so well about their best practices. What's the difference? And much of this is basic public health issues around deep cleaning, a whole range of other things. But it's made a dramatic effect. Crime. Again, interesting that in the UK, we were in a position where we had over 40 constabularies, police forces, publish their data every month, the reported crime. What and where. Not for every class of crime. Some were, we had, in releasing this data, we had quite serious discussions with the Home Office and also with the Information Commissioner's Office about where we might be actually not wanting to reveal exact location because of victim vulnerability, for example. So domestic violence is not mapped on this. But a great majority of the reported crime is. We can now see the hotspots, the tools that have been produced are now routinely used by the police forces themselves. This is not tools that they wrote for themselves. It's driving insurance behavior, as might expect. It hasn't led to a collapse in house prices, as some people anticipated. People kind of just have access to the data. And the data's got better too, because it turned out when this was published out, that the data collection hadn't always been to the standards you might expect. And that particularly true, my favorite example is in transport, where we finally got the government to publish where all the bus stops are. You wouldn't think that was a national secret. Well, perhaps some people would think it might be, you know. People do appeal for all sorts of reasons about why you shouldn't release data. And the location of the bus stops, finally published. 360,000 of them in the United Kingdom. 17,000 of them weren't where the government thought they were. Okay, and we laugh, but if you think about it for a minute, you think, well, you know, they can move, or roadworks, or been decommissioned, or keeping a database current, as you would know better than most, is a significantly challenging job. When you publish the data out, people can start to go to work on it. And actually, quite quickly when that happened, a crowdsourcing site was put together to report where the bus stops actually were. Okay, and that's become quite an important resource. And before we laugh at the government, an 8% error rate in databases, well, I know databases that do rather worse than that. So actually, again, the issue of maintaining quality in databases is a serious one. But the whole landscape in transport has changed. As, for example, Transport for London now routinely makes all its transport data, timetables, route positions, real-time positions of underground issues, publicly available. And the innovation around apps for that has been very substantial. And I'll come on to a couple of examples of that. And research itself. So interestingly, in science and engineering and other areas of research, funded by publicly funded research, much of it, there's been quite a lot of contesting about whether the data should be made publicly available and how. And does this give unfair advantages to other countries who haven't done the research? There's quite an interesting debate around this. And a report commissioned by the Royal Society called Science as an Open Enterprise, I commend it actually, a really powerful argument for why the default in general should be to have this data available because of the effects of innovation and generation around it. There will always be exceptions. We're not destroying IP entirely, so companies who jointly fund research have IP rights in that, and not all of this data is disclosed all of the time. But the default behavior, the default assumption is publish the data unless there's a good reason not to. And these are now some of the public data principles that this government has adopted. And I think in a sense, that's, in a way, it's not just the technology underpinning this. I think accomplishments that I'm most proud of is the fact that this is now where the setting has been moved to. Now, whether every department behaves in line with these principles takes longer to change behavior sometimes, but they're good principles to start from. The licensing of this data has been critical, so the development of the so-called open government license has been hugely helpful because it removes the ambiguity and uncertainty around how you can use this data. And standards are essential. So one of the things that Tim Berners-Lee and I have been banging on about is that, yes, put your data on the web, any format will do with an open license, will give you a star, 1 star, yeah, for at least trying. But actually, a PDF file isn't the easiest thing to consume. If you can make it available as structured data, even if it's an Excel spreadsheet, for example, with an open license, you get 2 stars. But imagine if you were using open format. So rather than the proprietary Microsoft spreadsheet format, what if you used a CSV format? So any spreadsheet could consume it. Well, that gets you 3 stars with an open license. And the thing we've been trying to move to is a really powerful but simple idea. It's that you use strong identifiers, persistent ways of referring to the data itself in publishing this stuff. The term we use are URIs. It's a web address, essentially. Think of it as a web address for a piece of data or information. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because that's, I think, one of the really foundational parts of moving to a world where data can interconnect, using stable, persistent identifiers. And the most credit is when you start to notice that you can link your data set to other people's data. So you can publish it out in a way that gets a network effect between data sets. So here's an example where that's exactly happening. The Ordnance Survey, who didn't used to publish a good chunk of its data as open data at all. I mean, the complete change here has been about half of its data is now available under an open license. Postcodes you used to have to pay for to use, okay? Now available as open data with a completely worked out scheme, authoritative, because it's from the Ordnance Survey, of referring to those. So the URI, you can't see, but on the right-hand side there, there's a long web address, which is the URI for a particular postcode, okay? Or an administrative area, parish, boundary, constituency. All of the geographic structural data that we need to live our lives as legal citizens or to do various forms run various forms of service are now available using this scheme. And we've been generating identifiers for schools and roads and bus stops, administrative boundaries. And if you do that, the great thing about geographic data is that everything happens somewhere. And if you can persuade another department to use this standard way of referring to a place and space using this identificatory scheme, the data links. And the vision we're after here is something we call the linked web of data. Creating, using, and sharing URIs. And this is a diagram from 2010, a number of years ago. The interesting thing about that is really rather quickly, we started to see these are all the data sets at that time which were published as so-called linked open data. They were using this high-grade standard for publishing the data out. And there's a blue chunk on the left there, which was the then emerging data sets that referred to government data. It's much bigger now. Although it's still work in progress, we still, for all the open data published by the UK government or the US government, still a relatively small fraction of it is published to this standard. But this standard is powerful because it allows data to meaningfully connect to other data. So we've done it recently. Companies House, which is the UK statutory body that issues company registrations, manages company registrations. So it's the list of all the legal registered businesses in the UK, publishes those as open data using a persistent URI scheme. The great thing about that is government now has the opportunity to use a clearly stable identifier for this type of data when it's talking about contracts, spending, when it's talking about the ways in which it wants to understand and analyze research in the UK or where employment is. Okay. You wouldn't believe, well, you would believe, I'm sure, the number of ways in which the same object can be unhelpfully described, such that it actually is a huge effort of work to disinter the actual semantics, the meaning of what the object is. So we think this is really important work, and it's one of the reasons, as I say, why the ODI has been working with Thomson Reuters to help develop some of its identificatory schemes to these standards. Now, here's another example where this high standard is being followed. It's actually the Department for Local Government, Communities and Local Government. This is the local government structures in the UK are beginning to publish their data to these standards. And it allows you to do all sorts of analyses around the demographics of a region, the actual local spend levels, the level of educational uptake, a whole range of data that's being collected together. And what we're beginning to see is the emergence of what I take to be a really hugely important new information asset, not just economically, but for the country's well-being. It's an information infrastructure that is national and open, that refers to how we map the country, how we address it, how we conduct transport or educate or our health services. Elements of the key data that a nation needs to kind of run and operate is starting to kind of appear. There's a lot of work to still do on this, and the agreements about what should be in that infrastructure, what needs to be open, what has to stay closed. You're not going to publish every aspect of your national information infrastructure as open data. That's very much a work in progress. And the point about this whole movement is that it has benefits on a number of different axes. The great thing about open data is that it doesn't have one benefit. And I think the reason we see in the US, for example, one of the very few acts of Congress passed recently was the Data Act, because actually Republicans would like to have the data for certain purposes and Democrats for others. Left and right still need data for their particular political interests. So around transparency, accountability, participation, open data is useful. For research, clearly it can be helpful. For the media, they love to get hold of their data-driven stories. The data itself improves from being published. There are social and economic benefits. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the economic ones in particular and what the ODI is trying to achieve there. So as I say, we've been around for a couple of years, and our mission really was to try and help stimulate and develop the ecosystem around open data, in particular the demand side. It's all very well to publish the data, but what you really want is vibrant consumption of the data. That'll ensure the data will be fit for purpose, what the purposes it's put to, and continue to appear. So here are some examples of our first from our first couple of years. One of the things we do in the ODI, we're based in Shoreditch. We have a full-time equivalent staff of around about 30 people at the moment. We have associates, around about 40 of those who work jointly with us. And we have our startups, again, headcount of around about 30 individuals, about 10 companies at any one cohort. We've had a number of cohorts in our startup program, and to qualify, you've essentially got to be working in some area of open data for your business model. And here's a nice example. A company that was specializing in big data analytics. It took a very interesting data set. It was the prescriptions that GPs write out all the time. Okay. Now, it may be surprising for you to know that in England, for the last 2 years, GPs have been publishing as open data every prescription they write. Not to who, but what the drug was, the amount, and when. Okay. Our startup took that data and working with some other organizations and looked at analyzing it. And here we see an analysis for a particular drug type. So they could take all this data and see, for example, what types of drug were being prescribed. And this is statins. These are drugs that control blood pressure. And what that map is showing you is the variation, the difference between various primary care trusts, as was. The differences between the number of drugs that were being prescribed that were white label generic drugs, in other words, cheap, as opposed to the expensive licensed drugs. And the estimate was that over a year, about £200 million, $300 million of unnecessary licensed prescriptions were being written out for this one class of drug in the English health system. That's a big number, okay? This isn't a model, this is all the data, okay? And of course, the question is, what do you do about that insight? How can you change and intervene? How can behavior change? Actually, in this case, some of the drugs in question were coming off of their license because the patents were expiring. But it's a really interesting example of where insight can be gained. And there's the website there. Here's another example, quite well known by now. This is a company called Open Corporates. That map there is a map of beneficial ownership. So this is data now open about who owns who. And this is the network for one of the American banks, for Goldman Sachs. And what's interesting is to see where who owns who are based and located. That large landmass of the United States is the Cayman Islands, okay? And the interesting thing about this data is how it can be used to render insight in financial context, in issues around auditing, in issues around legal liability. One of the real challenges after the 2008 issues was actually who did own who. Okay, and how do you unwind the various complex ownership relationships there? Another example, Spend Networks. This is a company that analyzes huge amounts of open procurement data. This is data from the European Union about the length of time it takes to actually get paid having procured the order and delivered the work, the contract lag time. It showed that huge amounts of money, particularly in SMEs, was being locked up in this very long and protracted procurement process. Or here, a very interesting example of the peer-to-peer network, peer-to-peer lending in the UK. The three biggest peer-to-peer daters gave us all of their data, anonymized, and we could then see how that market was working, who was lending to who was borrowing. And one of the reasons they were interested in doing this was in an insurgent area like peer-to-peer lending, people sort of say, well, banks, the traditional banks would say, we should be regulating this behavior. It's going to be big and significant and material. It needs to be regulated. The peer-to-peer lenders were taking a view, well, if we publish all our data, you can see huge amounts of how our behavior, are we in a sense lending in a way that discriminates or supports various forms of, it really is a powerful way, if you think about it, of supporting certain forms of much lighter regulation by having access to the underlying core transactional data. Now here's the example of the company that did put open data to work in a very impressive way, and this was a company, the Climate Corporation, essentially taking large amounts of US weather data, geological survey data, soil data, crop yields, a whole bunch of stuff that was being generated, and produced a micro-insurance product. What this allows farmers to do in the US is to essentially insure against potential crop failure. Okay. They were selling incredibly precise products around particular field configuration insurances. That company built fundamentally off the back of open data, sold to Monsanto last year for just shy of $1 billion. Okay. A really interesting example where the size of the insurance opportunity driven by these open data insights can yield real insight. Of course, they're their genius just wasn't in the data, it was also in doing the analytics to kind of drive appropriate policy construction. And if you believe various of the reports going around, the opportunity for open data is even bigger than this. Now, whether it's $1 trillion or $100 billion, one of the observations is that just in the area of consumer finance or consumer products, there are huge opportunities still around the availability and accessibility of open data, data around pricing, around product availability, and so forth. And where do these models come from? I mean, I've given you an example, an existence proof, but what kind of business can you build out of an enterprise where you're giving what people often see as the core asset away, the data, or everybody's got access to it? Well, for example, data marketplaces. We've seen a very interesting example of one of our own startups that's taken all of that freely available transport data in the UK, cleaned it up, integrated it, and resold a high-quality integrated service to users. There are the apps themselves that can come along, be provided, and come with all the associated advertising benefits. There are models of innovation where the use to which the data is put actually derive a second-order benefit to the organization who's released it. There's an interesting class of examples where the essential requirement for the company is to sustain and maintain, and in some cases regain trust by making data available. I'll give you an example of that. And a whole range of API models that allow people to extract value. And there's just some of them. You know, if you build an application programming interface to your open data, how can you extract value from it? Well, there's a whole range of ways, okay? So just because the data is available, if you've curated, managed, and integrated it, and are providing a service back on top, there are ways of monetizing that. Now, this is not without, open data is not just a nirvana where everything is perfect. There are challenges. There are challenges around the quality of the data. How complete is it? As we saw with the bus stop example, you know, how accurate? There are all these different types to consume and integrate. Do we know? Government data, I should say here that they've been talking a lot about government data, but the thing we're beginning to see are companies who also release some of their data as open data, or third parties who take it and represent it. How do you know the provenance of that is something that you want to back a business or a service off the back of? And in some cases, the latency of the data is material. How recent is this? The UK Met Office, our weather service, now produces real-time open data in the way that the US had been for quite a while, partly because they realized that in the US, there was an $8 billion secondary reinsurance market that simply hadn't been stimulated in this country because the data wasn't available. The forecast data wasn't available in an accessible and open way. There are issues around curation. How we can ensure that it persists, that it's interoperable, that we're not locking it into formats that nobody else can use. There are issues around literacy, I would say, an important one about not just how the general public can understand and consume the data that's available and interpret it, appreciate the context, but in fact, in business in general, you know, to be data literate, to be challenging, to be not always uncritical of the data is hugely important. And there's the perennial problem of security, the challenge of open data. Here's a good example, though, of where those two are always in tension, have been for a while. This is the data that's made available of ship positions, real-time ship positions developed by the maritime insurance businesses around the world to help them keep track of where high-tonnage ships were, and to resolve issues in insurance claims. Fantastic data. Now routinely used in small ships as well as large, in recreational yachts as well as supertankers. Huge lots of secondary benefits, and a boon to the Somali pirates because they could also use that information. So So there the challenge was to work out when you would want perhaps more carefully, in some cases, even obscure or withdraw certain of the feeds. But certainly, generally, the balance of benefits has led to these sorts of systems being very widely adopted. And there's privacy. There's the issue of privacy. I've written about it. It's hugely relevant here. What does all of this open data do to our privacy? Now, I've said that we're not routinely publishing information that's about individuals or that can identify them. But when you have all of these different data sets about health, about crime, it's the whole business of microsegmentation. You get an exquisite profile on a postcode, on a street. How far does that become an issue that people become concerned about? So I want to end with the claim that I believe that open, and it isn't just about the data, it's about the licenses and the standards and the access and the participation, is a new kind of innovative resource. It's one that businesses like Thomson Reuters has to take seriously. It's not something that's going to happen a little time down the road. It's gathering pace and momentum now. And quite aside from the economic benefits, one of the things that I personally always go into bat for is the fact that this has all been made possible by an open web. And the real benefit is not what we necessarily seek to do with it today, but what others will be able to do with it in the futures. So, you know, as Tim has said, we build a web now so that those who come to it later will be able to create things that we cannot ourselves imagine. And that happens to the data we put out there too. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Let's have a
I'll just sit down. That's one of them.
We have to do the chat show look.
Yes, okay.
A question from the back straight away.
Privacy question.
Yes.
Regarding, I don't know, regarding personal information, can you speak a little bit to the fact that sometimes you can create personally identifiable information from data sets where each part was perhaps not so worrisome, but in aggregate you can know much more. So you mentioned postcodes. I love that example because, you know, in the UK, a postcode uniquely identifies a block of 15 houses or households or so. So do you have like a principled approach how to decide what could be done if that data was aggregated? For example, company's house, you mentioned them, maybe that has directors' information, for example, which is personal.
Yeah. I think, well, it's a really big topic, and there are many dimensions to it. I mean, in some areas, it's also important to say that not all information that is personally revealing is necessarily closed, or should be. So there have been a number of cases where the public interest in knowing the identity of the individual has led to the data being published openly. So death rates in NHS cardiologists were published. I mean, the death rates of their patients, I should say. You know, so that was quite an edgy thing. And but at the time, Bruce Keogh argues that it's one of the reasons that we now have the best cardiology performance data in Europe. But so there can be an argument for data that's personally revealing. But you're right, this thing called the jigsaw or Mosaic Effect, where you take a bunch of data sets and together they triangulate. A number of things we're doing. Some is that when data is released at the aggregate or anonymized level, there are sometimes license associated with it which state that you should not de-anonymize. And the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, actually has, or in England, has a role to ensure that this is maintained. So if you de-anonymize, you can be held accountable and liable, okay? So that's part of it. The other thing is to work quite hard on appropriate anonymization and to do the kind of future proofing, to look at what might be the case, to say, well, if we release this, are we going to be really putting a large class of potential individuals at risk for being identified? And that actually happened with some of the Ministry of Justice data, which wasn't released because of that worry. And we have an organisation called the UK Anonymisation Network, supported by the ICO and ODI, which are looking at anonymisation methods in general. It's not just technical; it's a mix of regulation, soft law, real legislation, and the technology. Yeah.
I was struck when you were talking about the numbers that were the opportunity for open data. Healthcare was quite small. Yeah. And is that because of that, the issues about personalizing information?
Well, we've seen, I mean, yes, I mean, again, I think it's an area where you have to really tread quite carefully, and I think we need to adopt, in general, quite strong consent-based principles here. In fact, I think one of the things that has not worked as well as it should have done has been the whole care.data in the UK. This was an initiative to have patients elect to have their data move through the health system in various ways. And the worry was that people were not convinced that this data wouldn't be sweated for economic value without their consent in some way. Right. And so I think there are issues where you need to take, I think, the sector and the public with you on this. Yeah.
Yeah. When you've thought about, obviously you've been very focused on government and things like the NHS and healthcare. When you think about commercial organizations interacting with your organization and with the opportunities here, what do you think are the challenges and opportunities for organizations like ours or companies which?
I think they're very broad indeed. So we a number of things. One is to kind of take companies on a journey where they begin. Thomson Reuters is probably very mature in this regard, where they think of the asset registry, the data they have, as an asset which should be, in some sense, understood, registered, enumerated, reflected upon as to whether the assumption that it must be open or closed, or generally closed, I mean, that there might be value, where might the value be in more permissive use of this, more collaborative use? So that discussion about the data landscape for a company is an important one, to map that out, to explain the varieties of data, the data ecosystem that exists, but also the methods and techniques we have for helping in issues around interoperability and information blending. Mm-hmm. And we are very much of the view that open standards are hugely helpful here. They're helpful not because they require you to make data open that you've used open standards to describe, but should you ever wish to, or to pull stuff in, it makes takes so much more of the friction out. So from general policy to the kind of economic arguments through to standards, we think there's a whole range of engagement. Plus, actually, awareness, education, training. We offer a lot of that. I think and some of this is all levels in an organisation. You know, you've got to take the C-suite with you as well on this.
So I think that's interesting because it's almost, you know, right now everyone's talking about how every company is a software company, every company is a digital company in a way, because of the transformation, because of consumerization of technology, mobile and social. Does that mean that this conversation is happening at board meetings? Are you getting invited in to educate the C-suite about these kind of issues in a way that before it was never relevant?
I think they're definitely, there's an increasing conversation. So we have, in a way, some of our focus was around startups, SMEs, right. But the really big companies, the FTSE 100, 200 companies, we're seeing a lot more interest because there's a sense in which a good amount of the conversation, the data-intensive conversations those companies need to have, many of our insights and learnings apply to the data system in general. They're not just about the open data component. In fact, the trick is to understand how the open data element can add value and complement the other data assets in an organization. I think people are starting to see that.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think about is potential negative impacts on society when you look at open data. And one of the things I was thinking about is when you saw that crime map.
Yeah.
Someone could look at that and think, okay, well, maybe that raises insurance premiums in that particular area. And then as an indirect result of that, maybe everyone in that area, maybe they stop reporting crimes to bring the premiums down.
Yeah, that's a very, Okay.
So, I mean, do you see the ODI as having a social responsibility, or does that lie elsewhere?
No, we absolutely would hope we do. We'd hope absolutely have the societal benefit of this data very much to the fore. I mean, the crime data is very interesting because before this was released, we had extensive discussions with victim groups, with community groups. You know, were they happy about this balance? So we take that discussion very seriously. The point about negative impacts or unintended consequences, insurance is a good example because, of course, in a very real sense, insurance markets work by spreading the risk. And as we get more and more perfect information on where to locate the risk, you then think, well, you know, how do insurance markets continue to survive? And do we really fall into areas of disequalities where, you know, you're in this bad area, you're going to get massive hikes in your insurance premiums? And I think that's an interestingly important thing to balance because there will be areas where just because you know the information precisely, you're not allowed to differentially price. This happens, for example, in genomics, health insurance based around very detailed information about predispositions to cancers, for example. You know, so there is existing art in this area, but I think it is something to reflect on. We obviously want to support and amplify the positive benefits, but understanding where the availability of the data can also lead to situations where you want to kind of balance the market out in some ways. Good point.
I mean, it's inherent in building a generative system, right? When you talk about an open platform that's going to allow things that have never been done before,
yeah.
To some extent, you are opening up a Pandora's box, right?
You are, and it's a set of opportunities, and in general, I have to say, we see a very substantial set of plus points as against the significant but not so numerous negatives. So I would say that you're right to worry about this. But again, the question is, part of the reason for the open publication of this is that things can become more transparent. So one of the things that happens, interesting in heavily regulated areas like credit referencing, is people need to know that there's some accountable way in which the data is being used, or is there evidence that this data is being used in a way that's proportionate, or and I think there are regimes where I think we can hold the use of decisions against the data accountable too. Yeah, because not just the data becomes material when people are taking actions off the back of it. So it's looking at the analytics side to say, well, are we happy with these sorts of decisions being taken off the back of this? And of course, in many cases, people's actual decisions about what they will reveal for various benefits are quite striking, and not least again in insurance where young female drivers are happy to put a GPS tracker in their car for the benefit of the premium discount. You know.
Right. One more question.
Hi. Which are the main countries investing in this type of open data, or the more advanced, let's say, countries? Do you have an idea?
Who are the more advanced?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the Open Data Barometer or the Open Data Index gives you a quite precise listing of that. So I commend you to go to the ODI site and look up Open Data Index or Open Data Barometer. But I mean, different countries struggle with different things.
Britain was top, right?
Yeah, we were. But you know, it's eternal vigilance to stay there. And one of the good things is a race to the top. You want people to be trying hard, and certain countries find it much easier to read certain kinds of data than others, and actually understanding why that is the case and what we can learn from other people's best practice is really helpful. So the French, for example, have a whole range of data that we routinely don't publish, and very, very recent census data is published out at bulk levels, for example.
As we were talking earlier, I think Snowden's changed all of those conversations, right? We don't have time to go into that. I'm afraid.
Probably not. Just that. That's right. Yeah.
We've run out of time. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk, really interesting, and I think very relevant to Thomson Reuters. Really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
That's a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great.